Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. It's called Co-Designing Innovative AI and ADM in Social Services, and it's my pleasure to chair this panel. We have a number of panelists, and this panel will be designed as a bit of an introduction to each of their research, a conversation around the research, and then opening up for conversation. Um, we do on our right, we have Dr. Jessica Court from QUT. So welcome, Jess. Dr. Avist Ahmed Khan, who's an ADMS postdoc. Julia Goodall, who is from a Red Cross Humanitech, and Dr. Georgia Van Torn, an ADMS AI, and from the University of New South Wales. So welcome to you all, and I hope you find this panel of interest. I want to just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and acknowledge the warm welcome we received this morning. The origins of this workshop actually arose several years ago when I was forced to reflect on my own positionality in relation to the use of digital technology in social services. And I was having a conversation with ADMS Chief Investigator Mark Sanderson from RMIT, and he said to me, "Why are the HAS people always so negative or critical?" And this sparked to me a consideration of how HAS research, humanities and social science, might be constructive in building digital tools to support social services, not just being critique. So the second insight arose from observing how hard it is to get government organisations to change the way in which they do technology. As we heard this morning, we can see about the problems that Centrelink and Services Australia and government organisations often have. But this led to me exploring ways in which digital technology might be designed and deployed beyond government to advance human rights, justice, and well-being. So core to such developments is recognising that researchers and developers do not have the answers. It involves understanding both the realities of social service organisations and social service users. Co-design is a key part of that centering of people in a way to redistribute power in an authentic way. And accordingly, this session was curated to highlight innovative digital technology projects that have sought to approach social services in different ways. The purpose of the session is to hear about those projects, the lessons from them, and learn what, why, and how to co-design. So with that, we'll go through. Each of you will have a project to talk about. So first of all, Avis.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's panel. So the project that I'm going to be introducing is work that we've been doing in partnership with Economic Justice Australia and community legal centers about how we can develop tools to support lawyers in sense-making of documents for welfare rights claimants. And it's quite a large project. We've had very close interactions with industry partners, and it's been about 18 months now since we've been working on this, and we're working towards developing a tool. So on the right-hand side here on the screen, you can see images of ideas that we developed for how we can better help facilitate the sense-making of legal documents and client files that were created in collaboration with our partners. So the project basically started by exploring or focusing on documents that are gathered by as part of the Freedom of Information Act. So they're referred to as FOI documents, or within the sector, they're colloquially referred to as the brick, mostly because they kind of look like a brick when they ship them out to you. So it's like a massive ream of paper. And there's lots of issues with the brick, so to speak. It's unindexed. There's no table of contents. There's no way of knowing what's actually in it until you actually go through or troll through those entire documents. There can be an amalgamation of computer-generated code, pictures, text, and also with PDF readers, a lot of them aren't able to fully make sense of these documents. And to the point where the same document could be split over 5 or 6 different PDFs. So it's just hard to make sense of. So our approach towards this project was to engage with lawyers on different levels. So part of our research team also has members from the legal community. And then we've been doing interviews with legal practitioners to get a better sense of their processes. And we're also planning on doing co-design workshops as we progress with the project. So yeah, that's where we're sort of going with this. And our tool is called Mortar, because bricks and mortar. So we thought it'd be funny. But as we were sort of going through this process, we also realized that our initial assessment of that focus on the brick was a bit, I guess, not as considered in terms of the nature of the entirety of the process, in terms of the documents that are generated, I suppose. So we basically mapped out the entire journey of when a welfare rights claimant comes to a legal center and what that actual interaction is until they make their case or claim with Services Australia. And so there's lots of different channels. So there's the FOI brick, there are tribunal documents, there are back channels through which you can get documents, clients provide documents. It's a whole mess of documents that need to be made sense of. We also worked out that there are lots of different types of lawyers, and the welfare rights sector is quite massively under-resourced. So you've got a large amount of a very transitionary volunteer workforce that helps with making sense of some of these cases. But then you've also got academics, you've got seasoned lawyers, you've got people that are novice lawyers that are trying to get a sense of how to sort of operate in the space. So and everyone has slightly different requirements. And so what we've done is we've developed a prototype of what that tool is in like the basic infrastructure. You can check out the actual tool at the showcase later today. But yeah, that's Mortar. I think that's a
Thanks very much, Avis. Now, Jess, you're next. Can you tell us about your project and what kind of motivated us? Oh, well, Georgia, sorry.
Hi, everybody. I am going to be speaking a little bit about Nadia. This is not a project that I was involved with personally, so I can't speak, with any direct experience of the co-design process. But I have done some research with people that were involved in that process, particularly the lead on that project, Mari Johnson. So Nadia is what Mari calls a digital human or an avatar. She doesn't like using the word chatbot. So Nadia is a digital avatar that was designed to make access to the NDIS easier for people and basically substituting the need for people to engage with online portals and forms and things like that. So Nadia was created out of a co-design process that involved, and it was actually really importantly, led by people with disability. So this started back in sort of 2014 under a previous instantiation of the NDIA, which is the agency that oversees the National Disability Insurance Scheme. When there was a lot of support for these kinds of more co-design approaches when it came to technology. Mari, the lead, was actually the lead technology. She sort of headed a unit within the NDIA at the time. And her process was to basically get together people with disability, with lived experience of trying to access the NDIS, people with a range of disabilities and communication needs, and bring them together with technologists to try and create a more accessible interface for the NDIS. Because she was finding, and there's been a lot of sort of investigation and parliamentary committees and so forth looking at this issue of how the NDIS is incredibly hard to access, it's bureaucratic, the process of trying to determine your eligibility and apply for support is extremely laborious and full of jargon for a lot of people. So the idea was to kind of break that down and give people an alternative way to learning about the scheme, learning what the rules were around eligibility and whether they would maybe be eligible for NDIS services, and then what would be involved in actually putting a case together to claim eligibility. So Nadia was constructed in consultation with people with disability, as I said, working together with a small New Zealand technology firm at the time, who was basically, this was sort of before chatbots were as common as they are now. And at the time it was quite I guess, really at the forefront of kind of chatbot design. Putting actually a face on an AI was kind of a new thing. So this was a really sort of pioneering in a technological sense as well. And I think the thing that I would really highlight about this project is how it is really a good example of how technologists, and I spoke to a lot of these people who were involved on the tech side as well, were, throughout this process in a room, sitting across a table from people with disability who were, able to say in their own words what they needed out of an interface like this, how they like to communicate, how the normal channels of communication or the common channels of communication don't work for them, and what they would need from a piece of technology like this. And you had technologists and engineers actually learning and hearing firsthand out from people's experience. So it's quite a unique kind of case study in co-design in that sense. And you had people with direct lived experience really informing in a very direct way how Nadia was, how she was built, and the ways that she communicated. So I'll leave it there and happy to extend on anything.
Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you. I would like to start by quickly acknowledging also the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. Now, when it comes to co-design, I tend to call myself a participatory design researcher. This is mainly a legacy thing. My background is in human-computer interaction, and participatory design is the term that took off in that field first. I mention this because I will use the term participatory design pretty much interchangeably with co-design, and I don't want anyone to be confused when I do that. So, as a participatory design researcher, I see that the goal of technology development, and now more and more AI development, is to move from a technology-first approach to development, which is what we've seen historically, through what we call human-centered AI, which the cynical take is we think about the users but don't necessarily involve them. The more generous take is we do often involve users in human-centered, but we don't have to. The goal for me is participatory design of AI technologies, where we are working with the people who are going to use the technology as at least informants who are giving us the key information and insights at every point throughout the design process, but ideally as equal design partners involved in the design process. This ensures that we know what an AI technology should do and how people want to interact with it before we commit to collecting data and training models. There are 3 strands of my research that I'd like to mention to you today to give you a bit of background about who I am. One of the major projects that I work on is called Pushing the Boundaries of Participatory Design. It's an international collaboration that I've been running since 2018. And the focus is to try to standardize best practice in co-design and participatory design research. One of the things that we're doing for that is what we call the world's largest distributed participatory design project with children, because most of us have background in designing with kids, where we've been running as a pilot 6 sets of co-design workshops with kids from around the world. And we're trying to tackle a big problem, in this case, climate change. What I want to mention with this, something that to me was really quite interesting, was the fact that we weren't trying to design AI technologies, but the kids wanted to design AI, particularly robots and smart bins, and things like that, because that's the technology they can see emerging, that's part of their everyday lives, and that they think will help us to tackle the big questions of the future. Now, my main research focus involves working with the Australian deaf community around sign language technologies and sign language AI. In my previous work here at UQ, we thought we were trying to design a sign language capable smart home, like you see in the interaction demo on the screen. Now, at the start of the project, we thought that was all we were doing, something that you could sign to and it would control different appliances around the house. But again, I'm a participatory design researcher. Through our co-design sessions, we found that this is not enough. Deaf people wanted more. They wanted to be able to access information in Auslan in real time, and they wanted a sense of connectedness, both to the smart home device and to other members of the deaf community. If we jump straight into collecting how do you sign light, how do you sign fan, we would have missed the point entirely. And the third project I want to mention is the current work I'm doing in partnership with Sydney Trains. We're co-designing with members of the Sydney deaf community a system for automatically translating train announcements into Auslan. It should look something like this.
The evacuation signal has sounded. Please make your way to the nearest exit.
Again, we're taking a co-design approach. This has meant working with members of the Sydney deaf community to find out things like what are the actual barriers deaf people experience when it comes to public transport? What do they currently do to overcome those barriers? And what does that mean their experience is like? How can we make sure that anything we're producing is culturally and linguistically appropriate for the deaf community? And I think the most important thing is the fact that the deaf folks we're working with are urging us to make sure that the technology we're making is not just accessible for deaf people, but is useful for anyone who in an emergency situation would benefit from visual access to information. So I tend to say that as a designer, I bring a particular set of skills, but I don't know everything. It's only by embedding the end user's real lived experiences throughout every stage of design and development of AI technologies that we're going to build something that meets their real needs. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia Goodall and I'm here from Australian Red Cross's Humanitech. We're an innovation initiative of Australian Red Cross that started a number of years ago when Red Cross was particularly concerned about the harms that could be caused by emerging technologies and particularly how to protect people that might struggle with equitable access into technologies. We've heard a lot about that in the first panel. So we started from a harm minimization approach and we very quickly matched that with an understanding of the opportunities and the potential of emerging technologies to transform the humanitarian sector if it could be done safely, equitably, inclusively. So we started perhaps from a policy and a research interest in how can we understand both the potential and the impacts of technology in humanitarian work and how it can support communities, particularly in developing climate resilience. And we pretty quickly decided that in order to talk about the potential and to really advocate against potential harm, we needed to be involved in the doing itself so we could really learn what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what does it really look like to design humanitarian technology uses. So for the last 5 years, we've run a number of projects through innovation incubators and accelerators in partnership with Telstra Foundation and QBE Foundation, where we partner up with both corporate and technology startups and our practitioners and communities on the ground to co-design technologies we can use in our disaster resilience work and to pilot them in the field. And it's been a really interesting process. Out of it, as you can see up on the screen, we've developed a series of principles of what we're learning it takes to co-design these technologies and how we can support both the humanitarian practitioners to understand the skills they need to engage with communities, engage with the technology and the innovators themselves, but particularly how we can work with funders and technologists to understand how to slow down and how to do true co-design, and to really understand the benefits in doing so in terms of both designing better technology that actually works and communities will use, and reducing many of the risks that ADM can pose, particularly to people that are experiencing multiple and marginalized vulnerabilities. But also to really unlock the ability for very different players and stakeholders to actually work together and learn from lived experience, so that we can take these technologies forwards and scale them across humanitarian work, which is quite a slow sector and a very risk-averse sector, understandably and necessarily, because we come from a place where our primary mandate is to prevent harm. But how do we keep up with the pace of change and recognize that if we can address and prevent harm, we can also really scale the impact of humanitarian work by embracing good and safe technology?
Thanks, Julia, and thank you to the panel. You've already introduced to us into many ways of what co-design or participatory design is, and I guess the question I want to have is, well, what does it take to get good co-design or good participatory design? Um, who needs to be involved, and how do you get tech people and non-tech people communicating, and even people, service users who don't even know how these service systems operate? Who would like to kick off? Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question, and something that I've tried to sort of think through myself in relation to Nadia. In that case, and my general answer to the question, I think, is there has to be the political will. Like, you have to invest in the right people. You have to be willing to, undertake design and co-design in a respectful and sometimes slow and very resource-intensive way. And all that takes political will, right? It's, you've got to have the people that are in positions of power and, that are pulling in charge of the purse, right? And pulling the strings and making the decisions, willing to invest in that process. In the case of Nadia, Mari, was tasked with this, overseeing this project. And I think, what sort of explains the success of that particular, of Nadia, was that she did have the authority and the resourcing and the budget to invest in a really great, like, properly meaningful co-design and participatory process. So for me, it's not necessarily about the tech, it's about the people, the culture, the organization, and the politics.
Julia?
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I think in terms of how we approach that, at the beginning of a project, we spend a lot of time looking at the governance and the purpose of the project and trying to set up project governance that shifts us from transactional approaches where you have a funder that funds you to deliver set deliverables by a set amount of time. And I think a lot of ADM developers as well work off that kind of delivery structure. So how we set up project governance that really has all the stakeholders agreeing on the problem you're trying to solve and allows for flexibility in how you solve that problem. So we might still have a project time frame and we have some best guesses of what we might try and do when. But right from the start, we make sure everyone's on board with the fact that everything could change. And I think the second point in terms of the how is understanding the capability build that's required across all different stakeholders. So there's effort that needs to be put into building the capability of the community and the end users to meaningfully participate in co-design. So making sure we're giving people the confidence and making the tech accessible enough, designing our workshops in the kind of ways that people are comfortable participating, and particularly when there's not an opt-out opportunity there's always an opt-out of the co-design, but they might not be able to opt out of using the end product, which again, we heard a lot about in the first panel. So then you really need to understand the power dynamics. But I think sometimes we forget about the capability build that's needed for tech designers and all the other players in the system. So making sure that these different groups that speak very different ways have translation in terms of how we work, and we actually build tech designers' capability to do really meaningful co-design and to walk alongside communities and understand them.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo some of the things that have already been said. I think to me, the core to co-design is the mindset. So I think it's more of a mindset than a method or an approach. So if you truly believe in the reasons as to why you're engaging in these activities, you will make the decisions in the ways that are not putting any of your collaborators or stakeholders at a disadvantage. And you're being a bit more mindful and considerate about the ways in which you actually treat the different information that you're gathering through that process. I also think there's this notion of the fact that expertise is distributed. And so it's important for us to engage with different stakeholders and different perspectives to reduce that asymmetry of knowledge, to be able to get a better understanding of the problems that you're trying to solve in a way that is actually meaningful and going to make some change. And I think one other point that is really important is making sure that the value that you're trying to create through the process is negotiated. So it's important to recognize that everyone within a co-design process has different perspectives, different agendas, different interests. And that's the way that the world will work. So having this utopian vision of everyone will get along is just that, it's utopian. So I think it's important to identify the fact that everyone's got a different perspective and negotiate what value is that we're working towards upfront. So I think that's really important to think through.
Okay, well, the downside of being last is a lot of the things I was going to say have already been said. I will mention that I'm so glad that I'm an academic, because it means that my barrier to entry for doing co-design is a lot lower. It means that when I'm saying we're going to do this project, I'm writing in we're going to be doing it as a co-design project. From there, it becomes important to figure out who are the stakeholders that should be involved throughout the design process. And I talked about in my intro that we talk about participants being informants and design partners. Throughout a project, there are some participants who should be design partners, who should be involved at every stage. And there are some partners who should be informants, who give us key information, who can be involved in co-design activities, but we're not necessarily checking with them at every single point. Depending on what kind of project that is, this will vary. If I think about something, kids focused, like the Pushing the Boundaries of PD project, for something like that, if we were trying to get to a commercialized product, then the way I would be treating it is the kids should be our co-design partners, working with us through every step of the way. But we should also be checking in with parents as informants, because we also want the parents in this example to have the buy-in, to understand what's going on, and to make sure that there's not oversight between what the kids want and what I'm thinking about as a design researcher.
Thanks. Just quickly, has there been any surprises in your co-design work, and has the original imagination of where you were heading changed as a result of the co-design?
Oh, absolutely. I talked about a couple of examples working with the deaf community. I learned things I didn't expect. Projects went in different directions than I expected. And of course, I do research with kids. Anything you do with kids, you're definitely going to be surprised. And often the kids will come up with things that you've never thought of that turn out to be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. If we sort of look at the example of the project that I was introducing earlier, we'd originally set out to try to solve a problem for the welfare rights community, and our go-to technology was trying to explore ways to automate that process and figure out ways in which we could build capacity for legal practitioners by automating things. But what we found was that they really didn't want automation because there's lots of trade-offs. When you're working in that context, there's considerations around privacy, there's considerations around being very meticulous and making sure that no detail is missed out just at the expense of saving some time. So the notion was, how can we actually help improve that process for sense making? And I think it's also important to sort of think about the way that we frame the project. So initially, again, it was sort of looked at as this capacity building work. But then the more that we engaged with our partners, we also realized that there are certain systemic things that we cannot change. So we cannot, for instance, change Centrelink or Services Australia's way of giving us documents. But we can do things that can help create capacity outside of these institutional systems. So that reframing, that mindset, all of that sort of came through those interactions. And I think that's a really important step to sort of recognize as you go.
Yes, I think there's always surprises. And if there's not surprises, you're probably doing some form of consultation and not actually listening or asking the right questions. A really interesting project for us, we've been working with a team called ClimateSense on risk analytics mapping that helps us to understand. We started with heat risk and overlay that with social vulnerability to understand where we should target our heat response services. We initially thought we were going to use this to help us scale this program nationally from a small program in South Australia. And because that works in a whole system of funding and government decisions and federated health departments, that's been really slow. But one of the things that came out of the co-design project was the ability to use it across a completely different program to understand. Red Cross has 6,000 clients in our aged care programs that receive daily support, and it enabled us to understand by postcode where those clients might be experiencing an extreme weather risk, and to connect our different services so we could actually work with those clients to prepare them for a hot day or prepare them for when there's flooding, and share with them specialized, localized information that if we were just engaging with a service to provide us with a SaaS tool, we never would have looked at these different ways of using the tool, even when the first way kind of got locked up and didn't make progress.
Thank you. I can't speak directly to surprises because I wasn't involved in the design process, but I think one of the things that I sort of learned or was sort of I found surprising in my study of Nadia was actually how some of the innovation and sort of solutions that emerged quite organically were from the community rather than sort of a technical expertise. One example is that the fact that Nadia was trained. So Nadia was at sort of a foundational level, a large language model that was trained, but the data that it was trained on was, well, amongst many things, a whole huge volumes of text data that was scraped directly from the NDIS grassroots Facebook page. So there's a huge community of people. I think it's like 30 or 40,000 people belong to this particular page that has long been associated with, it's a community of people basically that share challenges and also insights from their process of dealing with the NDIS. And they, part of the design process was to take the textual data from this website or from this Facebook group that spoke to the sort of key challenges that people were having with the portal or the website, and feed it into the model. So, and that's sort of one of the ways in which they trained it to be responsive to the needs of everyday people in the words, in their own words, the ways they expressed their challenges and problems. Because I think often there's part of the issue is that bureaucrats, when they try to foresee the challenges that people have accessing services, they either can't really envisage the problems, or when they do, the way they articulate it is not in the language that people understand, and so they therefore can't design the design process doesn't actually reflect the experience of the end users or the types of language that they use. And so here you had a model that was trained on the direct forms of communication and language of the end users, which I just thought was quite an innovative and sort of almost like lo-fi approach. And that the solution in this example was actually kind of there all along. It was like in the community, and it was acknowledging that the community had its own resources and expertise to give. Yeah.
Thanks, Georgia. You before you're talking about some of the barrier, the challenges or the things that made Nadia happen, like the finances and the leadership and the political will to do things. So my next question was really about, well, what are the barriers as well as the enablers within organisations? And if you were trying to convince an organisation to do it, what would you say to them using co-design?
That's a really good question.
You don't want to be handed on if you like.
I think one of the barriers I'd want to highlight that we perhaps don't think about enough is that there's huge benefit to communities in being involved in co-design, and particularly when we get to an end product that's really great and meets their needs. I think there's also risks, and I think sometimes we don't think enough about the risks when we're engaging with a community, and that's everything from the fact that sometimes we don't produce something that works, and we have to be free to sort of fail and learn and recognize when we're not getting to an outcome. So we have to make sure we're setting up co-design in a way that doesn't create unfair expectations where we're promising something that by nature of a co-design process we might not deliver. And we think more deeply, depending on what we're designing, there's risks in terms of how people participate. We can re-traumatize individuals and communities by the nature of them sharing their stories, sharing their barriers. So there's many institutional barriers, but I just kind of wanted to really highlight that we should be really clear on the risks before we get started and as we go through, and that accountability back to the communities is such an important way of dealing with those risks and minimizing them as we go on. In terms of what I'd say about why we should do co-design, I think I'd give two reasons. One, I believe it genuinely helps us to get better tools and to get tools that communities are much, much more likely to use. And the other reason why we should do it is because it helps us to anticipate consequences and understand who might be left out, understand the harm that we might be causing in terms of how we design. And by doing co-design, we can start to address that. We can at least be aware of it. We can work through it. We can slow down where we need to. And most people that are getting into designing a tool, whether it's from a corporate or a humanitarian or a services perspective, they're doing it because they do want to have a good outcome. And I think co-design increases our chances of getting a good and a fair outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think just adding to that, there are very rational arguments as to why we should be doing co-design. So if you democratize technology, the likelihood of someone actually taking up that technology is a lot higher. There's also this argument for if someone is part of the process of shaping the system that they're going to use, they will understand better the challenges and the constraints that are present within that system. And they will also have a better appreciation for what has been the delivered outcome and I guess why that is the way that it is. But then I think there's also to the point of barriers, like I think there's this notion of thinking about the sphere of influence that you have. So you might want to do co-design. You might have drunk the Kool-Aid, right? So you might agree with all of the principles, the reasons, the rationale, but within your organizational role or within the project that you're working in, you might not be able to enact some of those things. I think one bit of advice that I would give there is, again, it's a mindset thing. So what aspects within your sphere of influence can you actually bring onto your way of working that imbue some of those values? And I think the way that you can sort of engage or convince others of the value of this type of work is just through examples, through demonstrations, through having them see evidence of the value of co-design. So I guess, I mean, there's a lot more that you can say, but I guess those are some key takeaways.
So I'll say one of the barriers that we often get to co-design research is that it is expensive upfront. It's expensive in time, it's expensive in money, especially if you're trying to actually work with your design partners. As design partners, it is appropriate to pay them for their involvement. What I tend to make as an argument is, it's a bit of an older argument now in human-computer interaction design circles, but the fact that it may seem expensive upfront, but it's going to be way more expensive if you get to the end and your product doesn't work and your customers don't use it. So if we can co-design, we front load that cost, but we make sure we've got a better product that more people are going to use by the end.
Sorry, I also, not to disagree, I also think that there's ways to do co-design that aren't as resource intensive. So I think this notion of co-design is expensive should also be challenged. Like, it's not always the case. And to your point, like, there's lots of business case arguments for customer lifetime value and actualizing that value upfront and having longer customers that over the course of that customer relationship will also create business value.
Yeah, I think we've heard all the fantastic reasons and rationales for co-design, and I actually don't think these days you really need to convince people of the importance of co-design. I mean, at least rhetorically, most people would be in support, and I think the challenge really lies in how to do it well and meaningfully. And I think we've heard lots of great insights about how to do that. But I also would just add, I think it's about sort of normalizing a culture of commitment to doing it well, and not just paying lip service to ideas like co-design, but actually ourselves as well. And I think I include myself in this, have a lot to learn about things like digital accessibility, how to include people in this. Organizing this very conference, I learned what it means to actually properly include people in a conference like this. And I think we all really need to commit to a kind of cultural change about actually upskilling and gaining that knowledge that I think some of us think we have, but we actually don't be included. And so, yeah, it's a culture shift as well. And then I would also just talk to a barrier. Something that I'm looking at in my research is around outsourcing, and how the fact that a lot of technology used by governments is developed by third-party private firms, right, that have very little commitment or incentive to do co-design, let alone do it well. So I think partly it's also about recognizing that the problem is bigger than the technology. It's about governance. It's about the partnerships that government has with the private sector, and the types of, the sort of incentive structure and the constraints that those contracts, put into place around, how the processes of building technology. And I don't see, when I look at the way things like the NDIS assessment tool right now is out, it's gone out to tender. It will have a major impact on how people are assessed for the NDIS. No doubt some company will pick up that contract and have very little experience or know-how when it comes to co-designing a tool like that. So that for me is a real issue of like outsourcing, and how we ensure that it's not just government that has a responsibility to co-design, but also private sector. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I know we're running out of time, but before we finish, I do want to thank Jess, Avis, Julia, and Georgia. Thank you very much.